Hello, picking up in Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 19. We'll finish this chapter today. We read about two men that Paul thought highly of, Timothy and Epaphroditus, them being the main focus of this, the end of this chapter 2. Beginning in verse 19 of Philippians chapter 2, "And I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. For I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your state. For all seek their own, not the things which are Jesus Christ. But ye know the proof of him, that as a son with the Father he hath served me in the gospel. Him therefore I hope to send presently, so soon as I shall see how it will go with me. But I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion in labor, and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again ye may rejoice, and that I may be the less sorrowful. Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. Because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service towards me." So we see here, if you look back in chapter 1, verse 1, we see here that Paul being in prison, but his trusted companion, his son in the faith, Timothy, is right there with him. And Timothy was with Paul. He served Paul faithfully. And we see here in verse 19 and 20 the attitude and the feelings that Paul has toward Timothy. It says that he has no man like-minded who will actually care for your state. Timothy was a trusted companion and a trusted helper to Paul. And that gets us to thinking, how do you serve in your church? How do you serve your pastor? How do you serve the ones that perhaps are over you? Are you thought of as a good servant? Are you one that they think highly of, that is trustworthy, that can be counted on to do the job, just as Paul trusted Timothy? So Paul plans to send Timothy to Philippi as soon as he's able to, and it says there in verse 21, "For all seek their own, not the things which are Jesus Christ, but ye know the proof of him, that as a son with the Father he hath served me in the gospel." Paul mentions in verse 21 that there are many people that are out to do things for their own glory, or to do things for their own benefit. But Timothy did it for Christ. Timothy did it to be a faithful servant and a trusted servant, not for his own glory and not for his own benefit. So think about Timothy and the faithfulness that Paul had in him, and the faithfulness that Timothy showed. He ministered at Ephesus for Paul. Paul left him at Ephesus for a time to help establish that church. And now we see here, a few years later, Timothy is still with Paul, even though Paul is in prison. Timothy is still with him and serving and trying to help. And as we see here, Paul intends to send Timothy to the church at Philippi. He says there in verse 23 that I will send him as soon as I see how it will go with me. So here's Paul in prison, and according to this verse, I would think that Paul doesn't even know what's going to happen to him. He's kind of under this house arrest, but he hasn't had the final verdict on what's going to happen. And with such uncertainty in Paul's life, I can't imagine that he could be settled, or that he could be in any kind of comfort or state of mind to minister. But if you go back to verse 19, the first sentence there in verse 19, "But I trust in the Lord." And Paul continually trusted in the Lord regardless of his circumstances, regardless of where he was at or what was hanging over him. And we see here that here he's in prison, but he doesn't even know what's going to become of him. But he says that once I see what's going to happen to me, I'm going to send Timothy to you. Verse 25, we read about a man named Epaphroditus. Now Epaphroditus had been sent by this church at Philippi with an offering that they had taken, and Epaphroditus had been sent to deliver the offering. You could read about that in chapter 4, I think verse 18. It talks about Epaphroditus coming to Paul. But it says there in verse 25, "Yet I suppose it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion and laborer and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants." Verse 26, "For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness, because that ye had heard that he had been sick." So Epaphroditus or the church at Philippi had collected an offering. They had placed it in trust with Epaphroditus to deliver it to Paul for his use. And either along the way or once he got to Paul, Epaphroditus got sick. And as we'll see later on in this chapter, he got sick and he was near death. But it says there in verse 26 that he was full of heaviness, because that he had learned that the Philippians were upset because they had heard that he had been sick. And so Epaphroditus' heart for this church at Philippi was really something, because it upset him for him to know that the people back home had heard that he was sick. That takes a special kind of a special kind of bond or connection for you to feel upset that somebody found out that you were sick. But it says there in verse 27, "For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow." So Paul was thankful that God had healed Epaphroditus, not necessarily only for Epaphroditus' sake, but for Paul's sake, in that he says that I would have had sorrow upon sorrow had Epaphroditus done this deed, done this work for the Philippian church, done this work for the glory of God, and then he ended up dying for it. And so Paul was very thankful that Epaphroditus had come to healing and had had healing for the sickness that he had had. And it says there, verse 28, Paul says, "I sent him therefore the more carefully, that when ye see him again, that ye may rejoice, and that I may be less sorrowful." So Epaphroditus is actually taking this letter back to the church at Philippi, and it says there that I'm sending him away carefully, knowing that he had been sick, but then trusting that God will sustain him, and that that we can all rejoice, and that Paul would be less sorrowful. So when Paul didn't take this lightly, that this letter would be delivered back to the Philippian church by this man Epaphroditus that had been so sick and near death. But again, Paul is giving God the praise for the healing of Epaphroditus, because the way I understand this, or the way I take it, had Epaphroditus died, Paul would have had such great sorrow, even in his own circumstances. He would have had such great sorrow added to what he was already going through. But go back to verse 19, and Paul says, "But I trust in the Lord Jesus." And that's the only thing that we can do in our circumstances and the things that come our way. When everything boils down, it's I trust in the Lord Jesus. And if we're doing that, we can have comfort to know God's in control and God will work it out, just like he has with this here, the situation with Epaphroditus. Verse 29, Paul says, "Receive him therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation." So when he comes, receive him. Be joyful that he came. Be joyful that he made it. And again, Paul is appreciative of the offering that he had brought him. Not for sure how much time had passed from the time that Epaphroditus had left Philippi until the time he returned. Maybe people smarter than me would be able to know the time frame there. I'm not for sure, but I'm really not even for sure. I haven't looked to see how far it was from Philippi to Rome, where Paul was being held. But I'm sure a significant number of months had passed between the time Epaphroditus had left Philippi until the time he returned. And in the meantime, like we said, he'd gotten sick, but we're thankful that he was able to return to Philippi. And it says there, verse 30, "Because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death, not regarding his life, to supply your lack of service toward me." So Paul was appreciative of the gift. He was commending the Philippians for what they had done. He was thankful that the work of Christ could continue, and that Epaphroditus was faithful to the work that he was sent to do, even though it made him sick and near death. And so for our own lives, how do we think? Do we think we're too weak to do anything for the Lord? Do we think that we're not capable because we have some kind of malady or we have some kind of issue? It didn't hold Epaphroditus back. He just continued on. The Lord took care of him. And regardless of the circumstances, Paul was thankful that he had came and that he was able to send him. And we need to apply that to our own lives and think about what holds us back from doing what the Lord would have us to do. Do we make excuses because we're sick or because we don't feel well or because we don't have time or because we don't have the resources? Think about that and put that into practice. What holds me back and why? And let's try to trust in the Lord to get us past our own problems so that we can serve Him, which ultimately, or we can serve others, which ultimately serves others. I appreciate you watching. I thank you, and I pray you have a good day.